it away, Norris.
Okay, so hi everyone. I'm really excited about tonight. We're going to be workshopping some tasks, but as always, we're going to go ahead and begin with our reflection from our asynchronous work. So if we can go back to our reflection and copy and paste it into the chat. The question was, what did you learn about your task or the definitions about standards, text content, or the product, and doing the thinking of the task yourself? So even if you didn't actually do it, just what was your thinking behind it? I would love to hear your thoughts. All right, and I'd like to go ahead and open it up for some discussion. So if you guys would go ahead and unmute and just share some of your thinking, maybe around your task or something that somebody else wrote.
I don't know, in rereading my reflection, I don't know if I was clear. Like, it was a really good opportunity. Like, I wish more of our teachers did this part of anything that they ask our students to do, because it really just brings a lot of, it just brings a lot of things to light, especially that, that alignment, especially. I found a couple of things, like the text that I chose. Well, I wanted, obviously, okay, so let me explain the flexibility part, because there's certain things that I kind of want, I think, as students of history to like do, working with primary documents, making arguments. And so I like those two things, I think, were at the forefront, and maybe they are like a big majority or a big part of all lessons or all units or whatever. But I think I have to kind of let go of some of, maybe it's not always a primary source that they're looking at, or maybe it's in combination with a secondary source or even a tertiary source. And then, do I need to be as strict to or staying to the argument? Like, I'm looking specifically at landmark Supreme Court cases. And the reason why I chose that particular benchmark was just, in visiting classrooms during that unit of instruction, it never really seemed like it was relevant to students, and it's so relevant. And so I was just trying to play with the idea of how to like bring in something that may not seem relevant, but really has had an impact, on society. I don't know. I was playing around with those ideas, and just in having to respond to it, like I feel like I was able to respond to it a little bit, but I had, I guess, a little bit more life experience, I think, and a little bit understanding of society and like the impacts and significance of those cases that they may not come to the table with. And so then I was thinking, okay, so how do I make sure that they have the content knowledge and the information? And the text that I chose, which were just excerpts from the majority opinions, like, I don't think would be enough to make an argument about which of those landmark cases has had or has made the most impact on society. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Or did I muddy up even something that was already muddy?
No, there's so many like powerful insights in what you just said. I was trying to like track them so I could say them back. But no, it's amazing, because like so many things out of what you just said, right? You realized that some of the things you went into the design process wanting to accomplish may not actually work functionally with the particular topic and text that you selected. And so actually just the awareness of like the flexibility that's needed as you go through the design process is one huge insight there, because oftentimes I think when we see tasks with pitfalls, it's because people are holding really tight to something from their original conception that is just not working. And so like being able to let go or like see the value in a different approach. And you could do, if you really wanted it to be all about primary sources, you could do that in a different module maybe, and this one can adapt. But also what you just said about like recognizing the difference between your background knowledge and your students as you did the writing, and needing to accommodate for that in your design and have the text that really give them what they need to answer, is another place that people don't always get there if they don't do that kind of thinking. And that's another pitfall. It's like you're asking kids to make an argument about something, but because there's nothing in the text to support that, it's going to devolve into just an opinion that's not really rooted in anything.
Sure.
And we talked about some of those key decisions and like those entry points, and like, are you looking at text or are you looking at something else? Sonia wrote in the chat about changing the standard to actually make the task more rigorous. So, Tony, would you like to give us just a little bit more context? Because I love that she's liking the work, and I want to hear more.
Yeah, so I had picked a standard because I thought my original thinking was that it was going to help with critical thinking. And then when I kind of dove into it, it was too simple. And it became like this thing where there's only a little bit where I could go with it. So what I did is I sat down and I looked at our test specs, because in science, we have annually assessed standards, but then we have standards underneath it that are also assessed, they're called. So I took the annually assessed, which is basically the main standard, and that's the one I'm going to start with for the task. And it actually changed my entire task and made it much more rigorous. So I'm really excited about it now. Maurice helped me, so awesome.
Awesome. Yay. Hey, Seth. All right. Well, so we're going to continue working on our task, and we want to start thinking about those skills that students are going to need in order to respond to those tasks. So it's really helpful in responding to them, or you can find some gaps in maybe the task or some additional skills that students might need along the way. And just as a reminder, we do have those 3 instructional cycles. So this one is really, really focused on the task. The second one is going to be more focused on the skills, while the third one is focused on the mini tasks. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Nicole. I'm so excited to see what you guys have come up with.
Yay, thanks, Maurice. I was just putting something in the chat, so sorry. I was just going to say I love all the insights that were generated this week, and I really, it's, for me, this responding to your own task is the single most powerful thing you can do to get insights into what's working and what's not working. I mean, the other things we do are really important too, the collaboration, the color coding, but until you actually test it out, that's just where the truth really comes out. So I'm really glad that that was a meaningful experience for folks here. Okay, so I was very sorry to miss you all last week, but I know that you had an opportunity to work with my colleague Sherry, who's amazing, and to get a little taste of the task workshopping process. So tonight we are going to be digging into Alejandra's task and to Seth's task to continue that process of workshopping and that collaborative element. Your name was on the sign-up sheet, Seth. I assume you did it. And then next week we will continue that process, hopefully with 2 breakout rooms where we'll have some simultaneous workshops running. But before we get started, I just want to kind of show you my setup when I'm doing a task workshop, because again, we're wearing our 2 hats as learners and as leaders. The focus right now is to experience the task workshop as a useful opportunity to get collaborative feedback on your task in its current draft form. But this workshop protocol is also something that you can easily use with colleagues. You can take it, it's very flexible, and take advantage of that in your kind of coaching capacity or teacher leadership capacity. So when I am starting to facilitate a task workshop, the first thing that I do is I get like all of my handy materials open and at hand, because you never know exactly where the conversation is going to go, but there are some common resources that you want to have at your fingertips so that you can make sure you're ready depending on the direction of the conversation. So I'm going to share my screen and show you my setup for this. And I mean, it's nothing fancy. It's just having tabs open essentially. But I start with the task workshop protocol itself as my kind of home base. And I'm not sure how much you dug into this protocol last week, but if you really just get to the PLC protocol section with these 9 bullet points, it's pretty comprehensive. And generally in a task workshop, you would not be addressing all of these steps. So if you're early on in the design process, like we are relatively early on right now, we're probably going to live mostly in 1 through 5. We're really just going to think about, is it aligned to standards? Does the focus cluster make sense? And where are there any possible like hiccups or miscues in the prompt that could lead to confusion? As you get deeper into the process, you could go on to, looking for pitfalls, which you all did for one another, or, using the curriculum alignment rubric to really see which indicators fit. But we're going to be kind of hovering in this territory together for these task workshops. But to support this, you can see there's a list of kind of handy dandy resources that are often going to be useful in the workshopping. So I just keep them open to make it easy to access them. I've got our standards booklet, or you could have your standards website, CPALMs, whatever is your most convenient way to access your standards when you're thinking about alignment. I have the task template collection open because one of the things that we often realize in the course of a workshop is that perhaps a change in cognitive demand is really what a task needs to get better. So being able to look at all of those templates side by side is really useful. The pitfall checklist, if we're at that point, the alignment rubric itself. And then I usually have core tools open because sometimes we go and look at other tasks for inspiration as well. So David's going to put links to these resources in the chat. You don't have to open all of these right now. I just wanted to show you, just my rationale for having all of those things set up and for having all of those links there for you. But the only things that you really need to have open for right now are the task workshop protocol itself, which is going to kind of guide us through the process. And then our first task for the night, which is Alejandra's task on the 13th Amendment and mass incarceration in the US. So I'm going to pop that link in the chat, or probably someone's already on that for me. Here we go. Here's our task. And as you're getting things open, I'm just going to kind of verbally walk through the key first steps of the task workshop protocol, because it is a really flexible protocol. It's not something that you think about adhering to like line by line in a very strict way. It's more like a set of questions that you can use to kind of spur discussion. But there are a few things that we do kind of every single time to get ourselves anchored in the work together. So the very first thing we will do is actually read the task out loud. This is an important piece because sometimes you can hear things in a different way than you see them on screen. So we always read the task out loud. And then we always invite the task author to kind of share a little bit of context, just a very brief, like, what are you really trying to accomplish with students with this task? Because the goal of the workshop is to help the author achieve that purpose. So we really want to hear from them about what that purpose is. And then we will start always, always, always with standards alignment. And from there, we'll go in various directions depending on what we notice in the task. We might go on to talk about the template or the wording or the text or what have you. But we're always going to start with that key grounding question for the group to discuss, are the focus standards clearly driving the task? So it's a little bit of a back and forth, almost like Critical Friends, where sometimes the task author is sharing, and then other times we kind of ask the task author to be in a listening position, and the rest of us as a group talk about what we notice and what questions come up for us. And that usually generates a lot of insights for the author. So before we dive in, I'm going to give you a second to make sure you have everything that you need, and then just to see if there are any clarifying questions. So before we get started, are there any burning questions? I see we're all popping up in the task. Okay, let's dig in. Alejandra, you ready? Perfect. So again, you have a chance to see the overview, but I'm going to go straight to the task prompt. I'm going to read it out loud, and then I'm going to ask Alejandra to share a little bit about her purpose for the task and what she's hoping to accomplish with students. So we are working in 8th grade US history. We're using task template IE4, which is analysis. And I see writing standard 2, informative explanatory texts, reading standard 2, and a Florida social studies standard about Reconstruction. And the prompt reads, after reading the Reconstruction amendments and secondary sources related to prison reform, write a response paper in which you analyze the effectiveness and consequences of the 13th Amendment's abolishment of slavery and involuntary servitude. Support your discussion with evidence from the texts. So Alejandra, tell us a little bit in less than a minute about your purpose for this task and what you're hoping to accomplish with students.
I just caught something on the task that I have to fix from you reading it out loud. So the one thing that I want them to take away is a relevance to how something that happened so long ago, how one specific piece of language shapes and impacts us today, and the conversations that are happening around it right now. That's the last area where they end with me and then pick up in 11th grade. So I want them to kind of make those connections between the past and now in that task.
Okay. So really, like you said, making connections between something that happened in history and things that are happening in our society currently.
Yes.
Awesome. So there's lots of interesting things to explore with this task, but before we go any further, I want to ask the group, what do you notice? Take a moment to really look at the standards and look at the task prompt and think about the question, do you see the standards driving the task prompt? Where do you see the connection between the standards and the prompt, and what do you notice? So take a moment to read and think, and then let's just unmute and jump right into a conversation since we have a nice small group tonight.
One of the first things that jumps out at me is in the content standard, just that explain and evaluate the policies, practices, and consequences of Reconstruction. So actually was impressed by that addition of evaluation for grade 8. So that's big. That I could definitely see how this is one of those heavy hitter content standards.
Mm-hmm. And so what do we notice about the connection between the standards and the task prompt as currently written?
I think I'm missing some of the language of my content standard in the task itself. And I think Seth kind of just mentioned that by saying the evaluation piece, that could be added into the task itself, like evaluate the 13th Amendment's effectiveness, or evaluate the consequence of that inclusion of that one piece in the language of the 13th Amendment.
So that's a really interesting observation, because this social studies standard, like so many, has a lot of parts. Mm-hmm. And so you probably won't be able to pull as much specific language from it in terms of the content details, because you're going to have to choose, right? Like you have done kind of a slice of this to do in a task. The standard as a whole is probably too much to do all of that in a single task. But what I'm hearing isn't a question about alignment between the standard and the cognitive demand of the task, right? So you have currently that language of analyze the effectiveness and consequences. And it's interesting to hear this conversation, because when I was first looking at the task, my first thought was, if you're analyzing the effectiveness of something, isn't that really kind of evaluating? Like that's kind of like pointing towards a different verb for me. What are your thoughts about that?
So would that start to play into possibly, like you said, depending upon how big the slice with this content standard, like how big is the slice, then isn't there an IE9 possibly, I think, an evaluation, or is that only argumentative when we talk about evaluation?
So in this case, the template 9 evaluation, there is only an argumentative version of it.
Okay.
Because I think the stance is kind of that evaluation is inherently argumentative.
Right, argumentative, yeah.
Mm-hmm. But I always see this particular task template, which is discuss blank and evaluate blank, as kind of a bridge between informational explanatory and argumentative. It's not necessarily calling for like a strong claim about a topic. It's more, it allows for a little more nuance when you're evaluating, you know, the effectiveness of something or the extent to which something is, and so on. So that does push the task towards argumentative, but it doesn't necessarily have to like fundamentally change the purpose of the task, I think. So
I was just rereading the task real quickly one more time. Here's a question for, like maybe it's in one of the documents we could pull up. Does the product of the response paper I remember David and I reading about that kind of an assignment last year. The actual product of a response paper, is that an argumentative piece, sort of in nature? Like, do we make some claims that would match that evaluation that she's kind of going for? Or is that more of like an analysis? Like, or do you see what I'm getting at? Like, I can't remember. I know it's in that assignments document, but I can't remember some more details about that, the response paper in social studies.
Oh, it's funny that is not actually linked in here. We do have this newer resource, which is just a list.
Oh, cool.
But I can pull up the types of assignments charts as well.
Yeah, because there was one that kind of, you know, gives us some information about like the response paper, and but I think that would all be in relationship to what she really wants to, what kind of thinking and writing does she want them to do.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about your choice of response paper here. Hold on, you're muted.
I don't think I actually picked one other than essay, because I kind of had, I said response paper. I think it was just in the template itself. So I wasn't very intentional with that.
Okay, that's all right.
Yeah, to be honest.
So that's something to consider, right? Like,
yeah.
As you make these decisions about the kind of thinking kids are doing, that can then lead to a more intentional decision about what the writing product looks like. I think in this case, a response paper is not inherently either one in terms of argumentative versus analytical or explanatory. Just depends on the nature of the response that you're asking for. Yeah. But in this case, it may not in fact be the most high leverage choice, right? A response paper is often sort of like reading one text and doing some kind of response to or analysis of that. And here there's, I think, more going on than that. And so it might be worthwhile to consider what else could fit there. But I want to kind of table that for a moment, to think about what you said in terms of the overarching purpose of the task for you was really about making connections between the past and present. And we've kind of identified that there's an evaluative piece to that. And one thing that we noticed, David and Norris and I were just kind of putting our heads together to familiarize ourselves with the tasks beforehand, is that without reading the overview, initially we missed that a little bit in terms of that connection being a really important piece of what you want to accomplish. And then we saw it when we put the two together, right? But that always raises a question of like, how can we get it as clear as possible in the prompt by itself, right? So that when we unpack that prompt, it can kind of stand alone and actually point students towards what we're looking for. But of course, then you don't want to shut down their thinking about it. You don't want it to tell them exactly what the connection is. So we were wondering if this might actually be a case where using a question at the beginning of the prompt could be a useful thing to frame some of that thinking. So how does that strike you? Does that seem like something you might want to try?
Yeah.
So why don't we put our heads together as a group and think about, given what we've heard from Alejandra about what she's hoping to accomplish with this task, what might be a question that we could put at the beginning of this prompt that would help make it clear to students that that is part of the purpose, is to connect those policies around Reconstruction to some of our current situations with servitude in prison, right? Feel free to put it in the chat or just talk, think out loud, and I'll record it here in the comments.
I mean, this is just improve this, but something along the lines of like, you know, has anything changed? You know, like, I know that's not it.
Like,
but,
does slavery still exist today? Has slavery evolved?
But Maybe, but you also want to avoid like the grand thematic question.
Right.
It's like we cannot answer that in 6 paragraphs, you know, like.
Right.
So that's the kind of question that could be like a powerful lead in, right? Like discussion to get into this topic. So, but you're right. If you think about that as part of the prompt, it may be bigger than what they're really answering. So how can we get that a little tighter, a little more specific to the actual analysis that we want them doing?
So that question, does slavery exist today, could almost go in the overview then, like as a part of that framing, but the
Or really the background for students is a good place for that, because that's
Gotcha.
what you use to introduce the module to students and get them
Gotcha.
thinking about what they're going to be doing. So that's a really good place to put questions like that to kind of lead into the thinking.
What about saying something about like the, what are current, I'm not sure how to say this, but like current consequences from these decisions back then. I don't know how I'm saying this, but consequences that are still happening, something like that based on what happened way back then. I didn't word it right, but something.
Yeah, let's massage it. Let's keep going.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking the same thing, Sonia. I was actually kind of driving more toward like the overview. Let's look at the second paragraph in that overview. Because I think that there was something interesting in that first sentence of the second paragraph. Like, through this module, students will examine how effective the 13th Amendment was in successfully ending servitude in 1860s and how its language has allowed for the current prison climate. Is there something that we could maybe do with that we can make into a question?
Like, how effective could the 13th Amendment be if this is the case?
What do we think about that?
Like,
can you say it one more time?
Like the last question, like how effective could the 13th Amendment be if this is the case?
Yeah. What do we think?
Is that a leading question though? I don't know.
How,
Am I remembering the 13th Amendment? Isn't it's saying that it shouldn't exist unless it was a consequence or
for punishment,
right?
Yes.
So, yeah, my thinking was going more towards something about like the 13th Amendment and how it, but then I just heard Seth say, is that leading? So I was thinking something like, how has the 13th Amendment, created, or not created, but how has the 13th Amendment left us open to, I don't know, I was thinking where David was going, like looking at that overview and thinking about the 13th Amendment and how it kind of opened up, or not opened, but provided the right kind of
climate
formula or whatever for, the increase in mass incarceration. I don't know.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking back to the very first thing that Alejandra said, and maybe it could be as simple as, what is the connection between the 13th Amendment and current prison conditions? Or just what is the connection?
That's exactly
what
I'm thinking.
Yeah, that's true. Keep it simple. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Simple work sometimes,
You
right?
said that from the first place. Go.
Clearly not. Then we wouldn't have had all this thinking.
13th Amendment and
what would be the right thing to put there between the 13th Amendment and current? It's almost time.
Conditions or
current prison population? I don't know. Current prison.
Policies or no?
Policies, yeah. I would say policy.
Yeah, I think there's, you can think about the exact right wording there, but I think one of the ideas that the students might uncover in the process of this, right, is that because servitude is allowed in these environments, that feeds the, increasing incarceration of individuals in our society. It almost creates like a demand for prisoners, right? I mean, I imagine that's some of what this is getting at and what we would want students to unpack. Yeah. Which, by the way, is just such powerful stuff. I mean, this thinking about how there is this lasting legacy of Reconstruction and that particular amendment is really, really rich. There's some good stuff on this topic with Facing History and Ourselves also, by the way, if you wanted to just get more resources and inspiration. This is one of their issues that they have good materials on. Okay, so we are going to stop there. We could keep going. There's lots of fun things we could do here in terms of, thinking about how we would change the wording in a different task template and so on. But we do want to get to 2 tasks tonight. So just, that was 15 minutes and a lot of powerful insights were just yielded, I think, in terms of the alignment, the cognitive demand, getting that clarity of purpose there. So really briefly before we transition, how was that experience for you, Alejandra? Are you thinking there's some insights here that you might want to take and run with as you go to the next iteration of your task?
Yes, I love the idea of having the question as the beginning, because I think in going through it, I was falling into one of the pitfalls where the task itself was almost going to be like, well, yes, obviously, Ms. Perez, like, this is what it's doing. So it wasn't going to allow for them to actually do the research through their reading. And I think by having that question there and then going back and fixing some of the language of the task, it'll be more of them doing that work through their reading instead of just answering the task in one sentence.
Awesome. Okay. I'm going to stop sharing and we are going to transition now to Seth's task, which I will post in the chat. And I'm going to hand it over to David.
Thanks, Nicole. So I just want to start us out with the protocol because sometimes I like to have a guideline and know where I'm going with this. So first thing that we're going to do is we're going to read the task like we did before, and then we'll ask Seth kind of that idea of what was he trying to accomplish with the task. So first I'm going to go to his task, and I'm seeing some faces or some names pop up. So Nicole posted that link into the chat, and I'm just going to go right into the task. So we're looking at grades 11, 12, ELA, and we're using an argumentative template. We're looking at A4. And the task says, after reading Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Compromise speech on the role of ... write a rhetorical analysis in which you argue how Washington uses rhetoric to advance his point of view and how, insert content here, support your position with evidence from the text. So we have some blanks to fill in, and it's kind of good that we're doing this tonight. And I want to thank Seth for being vulnerable tonight, kind of being voluntold to help us out with the workshop, because it's going to be really kind of an authentic experience. You might be in the middle of writing your task or helping someone else write their task. So I'm going to turn it over to Seth to give us make some connections for us. Let's hear from Seth what his goal was with this task.
So thanks, David. Yeah, this is definitely 100% genuine. Like, I need this little workshop because I wrestled quite a bit. So here's what I know that I have. I know that I have a really rich text in this, what came to be known as the Atlanta Compromise speech. I know that wasn't what it was originally titled, but just playing with the idea of that in 11th and 12th grade ELA, even though it's ELA, we're really, kind of supposed to look at some of these sort of seminal type U.S. texts and, kind of look at analyzing the author's rhetoric and considering the persuasiveness and beauty of the text and how it's accomplished through the language. So essentially I started with, I've got this text. There are other texts like it or complementary to it, but I started with 2 texts and there was some comparison going on between how one author utilized rhetoric compared to the other one, but I pulled back to think about just this one rich text and ultimately getting at, okay, so there's probably 100 rhetorical analyses tasks in the LDC curriculum library. So at first I was like, well, maybe I won't do another rhetorical analysis. Like, what's the other lens? But couldn't really find it. So that's kind of where I am now. And the part that I've been struggling with, probably there's some other things you guys will help me with, but where it says write a rhetorical analysis in which you argue how Washington uses rhetoric to advance his point of view and how. What I'm really trying to get to is the second part of RI 2.6 right below there, where it's like how this contributes to the power and persuasiveness or beauty of the text. So because it's kind of a controversial text, the social studies folks will know more about the context of it than I do. But so that's kind of where I am right now. I don't know necessarily. I almost like just picked RI 3.8 as that secondary focus standard. I was really honed in on RI 2.6 clearly. And lastly, I would say I struggled between 3 different task templates. Was it 8? Was I going to go A4? Was I going to go A9? When in actuality, I started out with a comparison template from I think IE5 maybe. So that's where I am. A lot to say. Looking forward to some feedback here.
Thank you for sharing. And I think he's mentioned already a lot of different things we can consider. So one thing I feel like you started out with was really that rich text. And you started finding a few different texts, and then he kind of narrowed it down to one. And then he, like you said, he went more to the standards, and that's where we're going to go next. So let's take a moment, and I see that you guys are all in, so you can see it on your screen, or I'll have it posted here. Let's take a look at the standards. Let's go and read the standards, and then really see where do we find language from the standards in that task. Do we see the focus standards driving that task? So let's take a moment to read, and then we'll open up for some conversation. And as you're finishing up, what are some things that you're noticing about the standards and the task?
I saw RI 2.6 in the language of using rhetoric to advance his point of view, where they have to figure out how it contributes to the power, the persuasiveness, or the beauty of the text itself. So I saw that one reflected there.
Other thoughts? What else are we noticing about the standards?
I mean, as I look at it with you all, I'm wondering if you guys are seeing like, so is it rhetorical analysis? I mean, you know, somewhat technical, but is that an argument? In which case, then I could do some work with W1.1 where we, you know, we make a claim and we support that claim. I'll be quiet.
I feel like we need more information on what the text is itself to help the task. Like I had to go back and figure out what the text is. I don't know if that helps.
That's a really important point. I just to jump in a little bit, what was it, Seth, about this text that made you choose it?
So it's really interesting. I mean, again, like I said, from an ELA perspective, we can probably, the situation in which it was delivered, right? Like, so almost like the reason why they call it a compromise was Washington talks about, you know, it's the rhetoric's off the charts. He just basically talks about that the African Americans at the time, we're going to go ahead and cast down our buckets where we are, which is kind of where I was going to steal that line as part of the title for this, which is this incredible, like, it's just such a controversial piece, or could be, in terms of a settlement. Like, if you allow us this freedom, this freedom that we've been allowed to, we don't need to start at the top, he talks about, and control votes or run offices. We ought to be content to start in the fields and cast down our buckets where we are. So it's just, if you're looking for a text So it's sort of that balance of when you think about that star, where's our entry point into a task? And this rich text, but I also had 2 points of entry, the text and how controversial it could be. There's more than one right answer here, but also just RI 2.6 at truly that 11th and 12th grade level of rigor, where it's analyzing how the style and content contribute to the power and persuasiveness of the text itself. So that's kind of where I was.
As for me, I feel like what was interesting about that was more contextual too, because who was the audience for this speech?
Yeah.
All white people, right?
All white people, yes. Yeah.
So I think you're kind of hitting home on that. I like how you're deciding like 2.6 is a good standard, mainly because you're really thinking about that persuasiveness. You're thinking about like the context, that kind of the historical context, but who your audience is, and that's a big thing to say with this piece of text. I'm also curious about like what you mean by on the role of. Could you tell us some more ideas, maybe like what you were kind of going for with that piece of the task?
Yeah, great question. Super great question. So basically, as I was entering in my thoughts into the template, at that point, I was just doing the classic thing people do, which is like, okay, I want to fill in this template correctly, and my work session just got cut off because I wanted to I didn't want to give away the heart of what Washington's speech addresses, but I want to put something in there as to the somewhat of a on the topic of, or on the role, like basically. So that's just a little bit of, I need to kind of finish filling in that blank. So it's like on the certain content. And I just, stopped there, but that's what that addressed. So it's just literally like, how do I finish filling in that blank without giving away sort of some discovery that we'll have as we read that text together? Because it's a short enough text that I was thinking I would introduce the task and then we would dive into the text, as opposed to having read the text and done some things and then do the text.
So a lot of the purpose of the speech is to guarantee that they're going to receive basic education and due process of the law. And it's for the Atlantic Compromise. I just did like a quick Google. I'm not pulling this like out of my common knowledge. Just want to say that. So could that be included? Like, how does the speech play into the role of making sure that the compromise follows through? Because it sounds like both sides are trying to get something out of this, and Washington's brought in to kind of help through that process.
So it's a great thought, and I think that's where one of the reasons why I wanted to use this text is because I was wanting to really play with the difference between what, as an ELA task, right? This isn't typically the kind of text you'd see with an ELA task, but from an ELA standpoint, how much can we lift just from the four walls of like what's on paper of the text without having to know too much about
the context of it?
But I think what you said, I honestly think we could lift a lot of that through the close reading, but it's a great thought.
I can't stop myself. I have to. This is so interesting. Because this is a key question about ELA tasks, right? You could write another, like you said, Seth, like another rhetorical analysis task that basically just uses the exact language of the ELA standards, and it would probably be good to go because that's important work. But the ELA standards leave room for that greater specificity about the text and its context, right? If they're asking you to attend to the author's point of view or purpose, then being more specific about what that point of view or purpose is in the task makes a lot of sense. And so this is an opportunity to go past, in a way, or like through the exact language of the standards to how those standards actually manifest in this particular text, right? So like you could say, and to really get into this, we would have to dig into the text together. So you really could say, instead of saying how Washington uses rhetoric, you could actually determine what are some of the key rhetorical devices that he utilizes. And those in the prompt instead of just rhetoric. Or instead of saying to advance his point of view, you could get more specific around, how does he use those rhetorical devices to, like Alejandra was saying, ensure the success of the compromise, or something more specific like that. So there's lots of opportunity here to figure out that level of specificity that will make this a task about the Atlanta Compromise speech and not just a generic rhetorical analysis task.
Yep. That's good.
We've had some really good conversations too. I also want to hear some thoughts about this writing standard, because I'm not gonna lie, I was a little intimidated at first. Was anyone else, when they read this, a little intimidated? No, maybe it was just me.
No, I mean that was something I was gonna
No.
that, but I decided not to because of all the other stuff. But I was just gonna post, like, side note, I was really wrestling with, like, maybe rhetorical analysis isn't the right product I'm looking for, but essentially, I really am kind of gravitating to this argument standard. Like, we're in 11th, 12th grade here. There's a difference between the work that we're going to do at this grade level than what we did in grades 9 and 10. And we very rarely see kids have the opportunity to dig into that. So I'm trying to go for it, but yeah, however to get there.
So some people will actually take kind of the overarching standard for like 1.1, W1.1, or even like a piece of it. Would there be something that you might want to hit home on, like from A, B, C, D, E? Would there be a piece of that, or do you feel like you're going more for the overall standard?
So great question, and I couldn't figure out how to pick one of the substandards as a focus.
Okay.
Literally.
In Core Tools, the Florida ones only appear as everything together. So you could use the Common Core version, which I know is like anathema today.
Okay.
But if you
but
go to
that
the Common Core version,
that explains it, because I really went in and I was trying to choose one of the substandards from the simple fact that I knew, like, okay, the focus is going to be on our reading and analysis, and I'm not going to go as deep into like A through E. So of the substandards, it's really basically A and B. That's kind of really where I want to hone in. So great thought, David.
Well, what's the rest of the group also think? Now that we know it's more toward A and B, what are we thinking about some of the, how can we relate A and B or bring some of that language into the task?
So I don't know if this would take away from your initial purpose, but I love how B includes those counterclaims, because you can bring so much rich discussion and writing just from that. But again, I don't know if that was something you would want them to touch on, or for that to be a focus, like the different claims.
Yeah, and that's where some of that could come from. I was also sort of secretly thinking, hey, this is 11th grade. They're also taking U.S. history. So I was trying to think about, I was all over the place, but I was trying to think about how maybe some of the content that they're getting in social studies could impact their interaction with this text. In which case, when they're developing some counterclaims fairly and thoroughly, they're going to be anticipating what the other side, right? So, but it's not the other side of what Washington was talking about. It would be the other side of their own case.
I was thinking, well, when I first saw was thinking about the text too, and how his own, like how other African Americans felt about his speech. I think that had that was a place for some rich conversation, because, I don't believe that the entire, I don't know if I'm coming, I don't know. I think that'd be a rich conversation right there. How other, African Americans felt about what he was saying.
Yeah, from a history standpoint, I feel like he's kind of selling out the freedoms that they've just got after the Civil War, and that would be a counterclaim.
Yeah.
And that is like when you read that, it's like when I read that speech for the first time, I was really like, wow, I can't believe that this text isn't in play more often. Just from, so yeah, great thoughts.
And unfortunately, I'm going to have to kind of cut us off because it's like addicting. We start having these really good conversations. And I love, like, from a history standpoint, I'm going to say this, even though we're talking in ELA. Yeah. So that's half the fun. But I'm going to bring it back home. I'm going to actually take a step back. We've done a lot of work, and like this workshopping protocol kind of gives us the guidelines. And again, it's not like strict rules, but it gives us a structure. And now we've seen it with 2 different tasks. So I want to ask the group, how can you actually integrate this type of thinking into your daily practice? So feel free to unmute. If you want to post in the chat, that's fine too. But I'm curious to hear what you guys think.
Can you give me more details on that question?
So I was actually thinking back to what Sonia was doing, where she was actually changing the standard and increasing the level of rigor. And I think even when I was going through this process of creating tasks, it kind of reshaped my thinking. So like as we're building tasks and like looking at how the standards are driving the task, in this workshop where we're kind of, you know, trying this and maybe changing that and thinking about text, how are all of these things that we've talked about, how do you bring this into your daily work? Because we have some different perspectives, some that are more on the district side and some more in the classroom.
Thank you.
So I'm gonna, I think I understand what you're saying. I just want to clarify. So basically you're saying like, how does this that we just did affect my daily work as a program specialist? Is that what you're talking about?
Yes.
Okay, so I think part of it is just, you know, collaborating with so many different people who have different background knowledge. It's amazing. And I think that, you know, as program specialists, we do that kind of within our own little group, but it's great to get more people involved to really collaborate and help each other out. And it makes it better. It makes the work better.
I was trying to say work smarter, not harder. It's hard work to like do this thinking, but when you have that group, even like someone in different discipline, you know, you can really bounce some different ideas off of. Let's hear from one more.
I think it goes back to also, what are you really asking of your students? What product are you asking them to produce? And are you leading them to just give you one answer, or are you asking them to become the experts in that specific topic and then go beyond and to not limit what they can or can't do? So, and I agree with Natalie, you can't do this alone.
I know you said only one more, but I just love the rich thinking that goes behind it. Like, you really are taking something that you could just kind of teach, or you can really involve them and have them thinking deeply about it.
Thank you all for sharing. I appreciate it. And it's true, like that's why we're here working together. So we're here for each other. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Nicole.
All right. Thanks everybody for really interesting conversations. Thank you in particular to Alejandra and Seth for offering up their tasks to allow us to do this thinking together. We're going to continue this process next week with more tasks. And I also want you to know that one piece of the support that we offer you as part of Quality Tasks is, in addition to this opportunity to collaborate as a group, we offer one-on-one workshop sessions with one of us. And that's kind of your final step between working in these sessions and then submitting your task for national peer review, an opportunity to really have a focused session, just again, literally one-on-one to get those final revisions in place. So we'll be sharing a sign-up sheet for that. It'll be separate from the sign-up sheet that you use to, you know, do your workshopping here during the sessions. And what we'll do is we will list a bunch of times along with, you know, which facilitator it would be at that time. And basically you just put yourself into one of those slots, and then we will send you a direct invitation to meet in Zoom one-on-one and really dig in, because we find that it's kind of one of those divergent and convergent thinking things. The group is really, really great for generating ideas and getting you going on your next iteration and helping you realize your purpose. And then towards the end, really bringing it home with an individual conversation to put a point on it, make the final decisions about where you want to land and what you want to submit is nice for, you know, making sense of all those ideas. So both pieces we find are powerful in different ways. So look for that in the coming weeks. And the times that we offer will be kind of like starting around the last week of our virtual meetings here, and then in the couple of weeks in between when we wrap up and when you're going to be asked to submit to national peer review. So it's kind of that conclusion of the experience. All right, so as you go forward from tonight and you are looking at the asynchronous work, you know, that's described in Core Tools and in the follow-up email, it's really less about doing action items in the sessions now and more about finishing this process of designing your own task, as well as continuing to explore what's available in the Learn tab in the course sessions, just to become familiar with that content, but not as much like actually working through the action items. So that is all there for you in the syllabus, in Core Tools, and in the follow-up email. We'll of course send the recording out. But as usual, we want to end with our final word with. So as your ticket out the door tonight, a word or phrase in the chat, something that is resonating with you from our work together tonight, and then we will wrap it up. Awesome. All right, thanks everybody. We'll stick around for a few minutes if you have any questions or want to troubleshoot. Otherwise, we will see you here next week.
Have a great night, guys.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Good night.
Great.